Before we get started, kind of just in general, um, as I go through this, if there are any questions, obviously, um, like preferably you can just leave them in the chat. You can like send it to everyone or DM them specifically to me. I'll try to answer as many like all the questions if possible. If not, I'll try to like group them together, answer as many as I can. But yeah, we'll have like a specialized Q&A session kind of towards the end of this lecture. If there's anything you want to ask out loud specifically. Other than that, like I'll kind of periodically look through chat, see if there's any kind of questions as we go along. So yeah. All right. Let me go through my tabs here and bring up these slides for today. All right. And let me share screen. Okay. So let me know if anyone can't see it. This is the topic lecture on executive orders. So kind of to start out here with a quick kind of definition thing, because oftentimes when you're debating at Nats, the judges aren't going to be the most familiar with the topic that you're discussing. And with the case of executive orders, I think a majority or at least a good amount of judges will be roughly familiar with what they are. But kind of to clarify for your rounds, right? Executive orders are essentially directives issued by the president, right? The president says to do something, and the purpose of these directives, of these executive orders, is not to like create some new law, right? It's not to say like, okay, I want like this new piece of legislation, so I'm just gonna like skip through Congress and do it, right? Although that's oftentimes how executive orders have like tried to be used, right? The overall idea, right? The like power from the Constitution in which executive orders are derived from is about enforcing the law, right? Because remember, the president is part of the executive branch, which means that they are supposed to execute the law. And like when they're executing the law, they can't exactly just create whatever new legislation that they want. They're supposed to take some existing law or legislation or statute and say, hey, this is how exactly we're going to enforce it, right? This is how we're going to like institute consequences or punishments, things like that. So a good example of this is if there's a drug law that Congress passes, right? For example, determining whether or not a certain type of drug is illegal or not, right? They are the ones actually writing the law, Congress, right? And they determine the legality of it. But the president, they're able to issue executive orders to determine how that's going to be enforced, right? So in terms of how to prioritize the punishment for certain types of drug crimes, if a certain drug is determined to be illegal, right? And kind of determining like the actual execution of that law. So as a result, right, they're not supposed to break federal law under these executive orders, since the orders are supposed to be essentially enforcing the law, right? All like new laws are supposed to go through Congress since they are ultimately the legislative body there. And yeah, there's a link here. Obviously, like I'll send the link to the slides after here. I think the ACLU page explains it pretty well. There's also some examples of, like in terms of recent executive orders under President Trump and looking at, like how exactly each is supposed to work, how like courts can check back, all of those sorts of stuff there. So it's a good resource to kind of get introduced to executive orders, I'd say. All right. So before we get into kind of like details in terms of like potential arguments, right? Let's take a quick look at the overall like broad picture in terms of how to actually approach the topic. And the biggest thing is obviously going to be examples. I've already tried to bring up a few examples, with in terms of Trump, right? But there's far more beyond that. Remember that executive orders have been issued for like hundreds of years for now, right? Like probably one of the biggest executive orders ever issued was the Emancipation Proclamation, all the way back under President Lincoln, right? And there's also other ones like a bit more recently, but still like pretty like last century, right? So FDR's executive order, which created Japanese internment camps. There's also Truman when he desegregated the military, and then there's Eisenhower who barred LGBTQ plus individuals from the military, right? So I included this mix of examples here to kind of indicate that executive orders, right? Like there are some pretty clear good ones, there's some pretty clear bad ones, right? And there's going to be a mix of examples that you're going to find throughout each debate, which is why it's very important to kind of know specific examples, right? And beyond just knowing like examples of executive orders, you should also like if there's a crucial one that you want to bring up in each round, you should also like bring up kind of like what happened in the aftermath, right? For example, with the case of Japanese internment under FDR, right? Like what did the courts do? What did Congress do, right? What was public opinion at the time? Research all those things because those will help you kind of find out how different factors can influence executive orders, which will probably be like mentioned in your debate rounds. And beyond examples, though, right, there's kind of a fundamental question about the topic. And I think that this question needs to be answered before like the examples debate can really become important because going around and throwing examples, right, I don't think that's going to be a thing to like clearly settle because there's so many examples of executive orders being good and there's so many examples of executive orders being bad, right? If you look more recently, yeah, probably it leans like towards a more negative side. But if you look like overall throughout history, right, it's going to be hard for the judge to like clearly lean towards one side, I'd say. So to answer like kind of win the debate, I think it's better to look at the fundamental question of like whether or not executive orders, the idea of executive orders themselves are good, right? So for example, like let's say the topic was debating whether or not democracy is good, right? You can obviously look at, what have different democracies done, but you can also look at the idea of democracy itself as compared to something like authoritarianism, right? Looking at the idea itself of executive orders compared to the alternative of policymaking, which is most likely going to be legislative, like the legislative process, right? That's going to be the crucial question, which your rounds should like come down to, and kind of answering like the actual reasons for like why exactly one is better than the other or one is worse than the other. That's going to be pretty important. Obviously, in order to answer this question, right? Not only do you have to like do some analysis, you also have to bring up lots of examples. I'm sure like every single round you have, you're probably going to bring up lots of examples. So that's going to be like examples are always going to be important, but kind of reaching for the root of the topic is going to be like the number one goal that you should have when debating. And then the final thing I included on this slide was to utilize recency bias, right? I already mentioned Trump and like a bunch of the executive orders that he signed, right? Those are going to come up like pretty much in most rounds, if not all, because those are pretty recent. And it's more likely that your judge is going to be familiar with an executive order issued like this year as compared to something like 10 or like even like decades ago, right? Because I mean, it's more recent. They might read the news. So it's kind of easier to if you're on the neg side to use recency bias and say like look at all these executive orders that Trump has been issuing that's been more on the negative side, right? If you're on the ask side, right, you want to do kind of the flip thing and say, okay, let's not get like, let's not fall under recency bias. Let's not only look at one president. Let's look at a more holistic view of like past presidents that have done good things through executive orders and things like that, right? So obviously, like your debates are going to often rest upon the fundamental question of like, executive orders versus legislation through Congress. And then it's going to talk about like Trump probably a lot, if not all your rounds. So yeah, let's get right into aft arguments then. There's like 5 main ones that I've outlined here. And I think that like ground on this topic, it's a good amount, but it's not going to be like as expansive as say like some other topics. For example, like the most recent PF topic before this, which is like the nuclear energy topic, since I think that those are like topics which are kind of clear to get in terms of like actual tangible impacts, right? Whereas with executive orders, right, like you can obviously find impacts from specific executive orders, but if you look overall at the idea of them, it's going to be kind of hard to find like a tangible impact of like all executive orders combined, like what exactly has it produced, right? So it's more so a debate about the idea itself, which is why I've kind of tried to focus on, I think, the 5 main ones that at least I've thought about here. And those kind of quickly going over this is crisis, legislative gridlock, social justice, clarifying laws, and then leadership. So the main theme here, like as we hop into the first argument of crisis here, is going to be that executive orders are much more efficient and they're faster, essentially. That's pretty much the one word to summarize it. It's faster than Congress because it's one person issuing the executive order. That's the president as compared to Congress, which is all 435 members, right? So as a result of that, actually, yeah, 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate, right? So as a result of that, there's going to be like a much slower process through the legislative body as compared to the president. So oftentimes in times of crises, for example, under the COVID pandemic, it's much easier to actually get stuff done through the president as compared to Congress because of the fact that the president just doesn't have to go through as many hurdles. They're one person and they're just issuing it based on their interpretation, right? So just like Biden signed like COVID relief, signed like other different things during the COVID pandemic, that's an example of like how during crises the president steps up and it's much faster and it saves more lives as compared to Congress. So couple key impacts you can have here. First is obviously natural disasters. Like if there's like any natural disaster, for example, like wildfires or anything on a large scale, and the president gets involved, they're going to be able to like take care of it much faster as compared to Congress. This also applies to like a bunch of different natural disasters like hurricanes, etc. And as like climate change rapidly increases, you can probably make some tangible argument about how it's going to be pretty crucial to have executive orders in order to like respond as quickly as possible to try to adapt and like kind of mitigate the impacts of such natural disasters. There's also pandemics, right? What I mentioned with COVID. Relief is pretty crucial for saving as many lives as possible, as fast as possible. And then final impact is conflict, right? I think like this is less so of a domestic impact within the US because I think most likely you probably shouldn't be reading like a civil war impact in the US unless you want to go for that. That's up to you. But I think in general, in terms of like conflict overall, if there's like some overseas conflict that America's involved in, right, and there needs to be swift action done. For example, like if there's some crisis, then executive orders are probably a much better way to take care of it as compared to legislation under Congress. So yeah, that's pretty much the first argument. Like the main idea is just that it's faster, and in times of crises, we need fast action. So yeah, let's move on to the second, which is second argument on the AF, which is legislative gridlock. And essentially, like this kind of rests under the same principle as the first argument, but it's like slightly different because this is more general, right? And the impacts are kind of different. It's not really times of crisis. It's more so general, like social reform and like policies being passed within the like United States, right? So as a result of like increasing political polarization and a very partisan Congress who rarely gets things done, right? Legislation, it's like passing at very slow rates here. Congress is almost perpetually in gridlock. And as a result, that sets up the fact that executive orders are very, very necessary, right? That's the argument you're going to make as the AF. And if you look like in terms of the trends of executive orders, I'm sure you can find on like Statista or somewhere that there's been increasing in recent times, right? Presidents like in the past have been issuing it like much more infrequently as compared to now. Like Biden, Trump, Obama, like they've all issued it at much higher rates as compared to like, I don't know, like Lincoln, for example. So that could be like a piece of evidence you use to kind of demonstrate the need for executive orders since Congress, they're not passing much. So we need someone to step up, right? And executive orders bypass the whole process of, like gridlock within Congress because once again, it's just one person. And you can also kind of make the argument here that the president is more directly accountable to the people. What exactly does that mean? It means that they have like a greater interest to serve the public as compared to Congress as a collective, right? So obviously, like both members of Congress and the president are like elected, like are elected in elections, right? But Congress as a whole, right, because they're made up of so many members, right? Each individual being held accountable can't really hold the body as a whole accountable as well as compared to the president, who is since they're one person, right? They're being elected. They're more like I guess within the check of the people as compared to Congress, since it's like basically 535 versus one, right? It's going to be easier to kind of maintain some degree of check on that one person, which is the president. And some impacts here are just it's kind of like policies as a whole, right? You can talk about economic policy, you can talk about like social reform, right? I listed like two here about gun violence and drugs, right? And obviously, this is going to depend on the politics of the president themselves. But you can make the argument that, like in the future, sometime, insofar as we have some, for example, like progressive president, right? They're going to be able to like institute these reforms through executive orders, and that's going to save lives, even if it's like temporary, even if it's a short period of time. They're still able to save lives in that period of time, and that is a good thing. So yeah. That's the second argument. And once again, like it's the same basis, it's the same principle as crisis. It's just executive orders are faster. That's probably one thing you're going to be advocating for very frequently if you're AF, efficiency. All right. Third is social justice, right? This kind of dwells on the examples debate because as I move to the next slide, you'll see like there's a slide of the exact opposite flip side of this, right? Which is just social justice on the next side, right? And the way you kind of debate this depends on like kind of how many examples you have, and within each example, how effective was each executive order, right? So on the aft side, right, you're going to try to make the argument that as a whole, collectively throughout US history, right, executive orders have been beneficial for advancing social progress, right? So the two examples I mentioned kind of towards the beginning of this lecture, Truman desegregating the military. Actually, the second listed here isn't one that I mentioned previously, but I think this is affirmative action under JFK, right? Those are examples of executive orders which helped promote civil rights that you can mention as examples of executive orders being really good. And the reason why executive orders are crucial as compared to legislation is that they're faster, right? Once again, it's faster, but also because you can argue that presidents make good choices, right? As long as there's a progressive precedent, right? They can often institute good executive orders which promote civil rights in a much shorter time period, which obviously promotes like shorter the time period, right? The bigger the impact because there's like more civil rights being promoted in a shorter time frame, right? There's a greater impact there. So obviously, this is going to rely on examples because they're examples of the flip side of executive orders being bad for civil rights, right, and like harming it, being bad for progress. But this is kind of going to depend on your research on each individual one, right? For example, like going back to like a neg example of Japanese internment under FDR, right? If you like, if on the aft you talk about how the courts like they weren't able to shut it down, and that Congress was going to like also support Japanese internment anyways, that means that it's not the fault of the executive order itself, right? It's actually like in general, it was going to happen whether it's through the executive order or legislation. It's through not exactly the mechanism of the executive order, but it's because policymakers at the time were instituting bad policies, right? Not specifically just the president at the time. That's an argument you can make on the aft about why like the neg examples of executive orders harming civil rights aren't exactly applicable. Because typically, the aft examples are the president going against or like at least advancing something that Congress wasn't exactly prepared for at the time, right? And with the case of like many executive orders under LBJ, a lot of them helped actually promote legislation in the future to kind of like actually set civil rights as a key priority of the administration and of Congress as a result as well. And that kind of set the direction of policymaking, which helps actually move Congress towards the right direction. Because prior to that, you can make the argument that Congress wasn't exactly focused about passing civil rights legislation. So yeah, impact obviously just helping the communities that you talk about. For example, if it's about executive orders helping like women, right? That would be your impact there. If it's about executive orders helping the LGBTQ population, it would be your impact there. And you can obviously like focus on specific executive orders that have been passed in order to find your specific impacts here. I think this is one of the like arguments where examples are going to be the dominant like factor in determining if you win it or not. So yeah, that's that. Two more to go on the AF. Clarifying laws. I think this is one that might not be as popular, but I think it's something that you can like definitely mention or at least bring up in rebuttal as kind of an argument alone or as a response to, like some neg arguments, right? But essentially, executive orders, right? The whole purpose is to set like the standard on enforcement, right? The president is executing the law, and as a result, they're able to clarify anything if any like laws are unclear or conflicting, right? So, for example, if there's a drug law that Congress passes and it's kind of unclear how exactly people are going to be punished under that legislation, right? The president can clarify that. And obviously, the impact here will be a bit more intangible since, like, what exactly does clarifying laws mean, right? What exactly does that even do? What are some examples of it happening in the past, right? That's obviously going to be questions that you have to research. But the broad idea is that the impact here isn't going to be like a numbers thing. It's not going to be like, oh, we can help a certain amount of people. It's going to be more so improving legislation because in this whole like topic, you're going to be debating between executive orders and legislation. So if you can like read this argument and win it and prove that executive orders actually help make legislation more effective, right? That means that you can kind of access the scope of both the AF and neg impacts because if your like side helps improve the other side as well, right? You're basically linking into their impacts here. You are improving legislation while also having the benefits of executive orders in your other arguments, right? That's going to be pretty helpful in terms of like, I guess, accessing the biggest impact in round, even if this argument alone doesn't produce a tangible number. So yeah, that's this argument. Yeah, the president can clarify the direction of any like confusing laws. And I'm sure, like, I mean, obviously you're going to need to find examples here, but the overall idea and analysis you're going to make is that, well, there are definitely laws which are like not being enforced properly. They're very unclear, right? And in order for them to actually have clear enforcement, you need the president. And the best, like the biggest mechanism that the president uses to do enforcement is executive orders. So yeah. All right, moving on to the final argument here on the F, which is leadership. Essentially, this is also kind of a like more intangible argument, but it's about the president kind of stepping up and taking the reins of policymaking, right? So, um, like as a result of Congress being in gridlock, right, being very dysfunctional, whenever the president issues executive orders, you can argue that that kind of demonstrates leadership and it shows America as a whole, their policy, like their government, as a more unified front, as a more like I guess clear, like going in a clear direction and having like actual policies being passed. So the impact is going to be like U.S. leadership, right? Obviously, what exactly does that mean? It's going to be like you can find specific impacts, obviously, but more broadly, it's about like it's kind of similar to hedge impacts, right? When you have like the U.S. like actually showing that it like does stuff and it like improves the lives of its like citizens, right? That's going to be good for the US standing on an international stage, right? And you can make a whole lot of different arguments as to what exactly that ultimately leads to. But the idea is essentially that it improves like America's standing in the international community, right? Which could be especially crucial at a time like right now when American like leadership is on the decline. So yeah, I think the next slide is next slide is neg arguments. So we'll take like a quick, like maybe like 3 minute break here. If there's any like questions, feel free to unmute or ask in the chat here, or just like any comments in general, right? Um, yeah, and then after that, at around 5:35 Pacific, we can move on to the neg side of this debate of this topic. Yeah. Do you have a link to any articles about how LBJ said? Yeah, I think this. I don't have a link on hand right now, right? I'm sure like I can maybe go and include in the slide, but I think this will be like fairly easy to find since it's kind of a common thing discussed whenever you mention executive orders. Since like Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were both passed under LBJ, and I know that a lot of executive orders were kind of in between the two, and I believe before Civil Rights Act as well in order to like set the direction of where um, of like civil rights legislation. So yeah, um, that's something unfortunately I think you might have to research, but I think it's definitely a good research area since it's like probably an example that's going to be brought up a lot in round due to its significance. Um, any other questions or comments? If not, I think we can fast forward the break and move on to the neg arguments. All right, sounds good then. So, yeah, moving on to the neg here, right? You'll notice that some of the arguments are similar, some of them are like different in terms of the idea that they're contesting, right? Like, for example, oh yeah, one more question. What does weighing look like for the AF if we aren't making arguments with empirics? I think the weighing is going to be like, obviously, you're probably going to have like some like Lincoln because executive orders have been pretty like I'd say dominant tools for like getting the direction clear for the legislative body. So, because I think ultimately the debate is usually going to boil down to executive orders versus like legislation. So, if you prove that executive orders can help improve legislation, right, make them more effective, or like make them, just make them more effective, or like make them like actually in the right direction and like good legislation, right? Both like effective in the sense that they're in a good direction and they have enforcement necessary for them to actually work, right? Then like you're probably gonna be ahead on the debate there. Um, Other stuff like you can probably do some like basic weighing with magnitude and stuff. That obviously depends on that's most likely going to rely on empirics. But if you more so have a broad impact off of something like democracy or like effective policy making, right? If you have something kind of generally saying that that can save X lives, that does has like X benefits, right? You can probably do some like magnitude weighing there. Yeah, I think if you're gonna do probability weighing, you probably need empirics. Um, Oh, time frame wise as well, right? I think like time frame is kind of something that's embedded into executive orders, right? Like they're just definitionally going to be faster than like legislation. So as a result, yeah, you're gonna have a better time with that there. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question about weighing. Mention an argument against the executive orders and negative impacts. Yeah, I'm gonna get to that in 1 second. Yeah, break is about over. I'm gonna take like a quick water break for myself since I've been talking for just under half an hour here. But I'll be right back and like I'll get into the neg arguments real quick. So hopefully that answers your question very shortly. All right. I'm back and let's move on into the neg side of this debate. So yeah, a lot like some of the arguments, right, with like social progress, especially, is going to be kind of just the flip side of the AF, right? It's going to be a lot of the examples debate, but there's also new stuff that you can mention here. A lot of it's going to reside within this whole debate about whether or not executive orders can be like can be checked back, right, under the checks and balances system established in the government by the Constitution. So yeah, quick outline here. Social progress is going to be a pretty big argument. There's also constitutionality going into the checks and balances debate there. There's also instability in policymaking. There's polarization, political polarization, and then concentration of power. So yeah, let's get right into it. Social progress, right? As I mentioned before, this is pretty much just the flip side of what we saw in the AF. The AF is arguing executive orders have been used in good ways to advance civil rights and social progress. The neg is saying it's the exact opposite, right? With the example of Japanese internment or when Eisenhower barred LGBTQ plus individuals from the military, right? Those were all examples of executive orders being negative, right? And as a result, it's obviously going to reside under this whole examples debate, which is going to be a lengthy process, right? It's going to be kind of hard to clear out. But the one good thing I think that you can have on the neg here is recency bias, right? Going back to what I mentioned, when you take examples of Trump's executive orders, I think they're going to be a lot easier to be like neg examples. For example, like the travel ban, right? It's going to be examples of just Trump signing a lot of executive orders which set back social progress as compared to advancing it. So as a result, you can say like more recent impacts, right, have been larger as compared to any historical examples that the AF tries to bring up. And because of that, right, that's probably going to skew the judge a little towards the neg since recency bias, right? Anything that happens more recently, they're probably more familiar with it. They're probably more like impacted by it. So it's going to be easier to argue, maybe like slightly easier to argue this on the neg, right? In terms of, yeah. And the impact, once again, is just whatever communities you mentioned under your specific examples. This is just, it's basically going back to the empirics debate. I think I mentioned this quite a few times now. Yeah, that's that. Hopefully that gives like some examples for negative executive orders, right? I think a very simple way, honestly, you can just do some research is just Google like list of like negative executive orders or just even ask like ChatGPT, right? like since a lot of the examples you're going to be finding, right? The examples themselves aren't that hard to find. What's going to be very crucial is researching what exactly happened in each case of those examples, right? And I'm not just talking about like the impact of like how many people were affected by, for example, Japanese internment, right? It's going to be like, what did Congress do, right? What did the courts do? How did the public feel? How did like everyone kind of at that time react? What was like the state which led to that executive order? That's going to be like good in terms of like clarifying whether it's the fault of the executive order itself or if it's just in general, right? Like the people in charge of policymaking at the time were going to do it, right? That's going to be something pretty important to resolve in your debates. So yeah, next argument, constitutionality. We're moving away from the what do you call it? The like examples debate a bit. I mean, this obviously involves examples still, but this is going back into um, like the whole efficiency debate, right? On the Av, right? I think two of the arguments like hinged on executive orders being fast and efficient, right? And obviously, there's a downside to that as well, right? If executive orders are very efficient to pass, right? They're very easy. You just sign them into law, right? Because they do have the force of law. Then it's going to be hard to like for different like courts and also for Congress to check back against unconstitutional executive orders, especially as the rate of executive orders being issued per president that's been increasing in recent times by a lot, right? That means that since they're issued so fast, courts aren't going to be able to check back that fast. You know, the Supreme Court can't like deal with every single executive order that Trump signs, for example. So as a result, right, the efficiency is a thing that bites back against um, the executive orders, like I guess benefits, right? Because if it's efficient at being bad, right, if it's efficient at being unconstitutional, then that means that fundamentally it's a bad thing. Like fast doesn't matter if it's like fast in the wrong direction, right? So that's pretty much that. And like once again, Neg's going to rely a lot on recent empirics and recency bias. You can bring up a lot of stuff with Trump and how the courts are ineffective at stopping like any unconstitutional executive orders that Trump has issued. And the impact, I think, more like obviously it's just the Constitution, right? If you allow unconstitutional stuff to happen all the time, then there's pretty much no point of the Constitution. You can kind of link that pretty directly to like democracy, right? Because the United States government, like governance system of governance, relies upon the Constitution. So yeah, any like tangible impacts here, it's going to be like maybe a bit harder to find, but more broadly, the idea is that you don't have functional policymaking at all if you start like just chipping away at the foundation of our policymaking, which is the Constitution. So yeah, there's that. The third argument, instability. I think this is going to be a pretty like common one. I think this kind of focuses on it also focuses on the fast nature of executive orders, right? But it more so focuses on like not only like the fast aspect, but also the like temporary aspect of it, right? It's not permanent because like legislation, right? Due to Congress like being kind of like carrying over very frequently, right? Congress doesn't like often flip all 535 members like after each election. Like it doesn't really do that, right? That means that generally, like they obviously have shifts in terms of policy direction, but generally policies are going to stay like have continuity, right? With the example of executive orders, on the other hand, that's going to be a lot different because it's the president doing it, right? And if you flip from a Democrat to a Republican or Republican to Democrat, and they have very different views on policies, right? Especially with more a more polarized environment and more like partisan presidents, that's going to mean that an executive order signed tomorrow might not yesterday might not exist tomorrow, right? Obviously, that's post-election, but yeah, like presidents will flip-flop, they will reverse stuff. This could be like a good thing in cases of reversing bad executive orders, but more broadly, this argument is that it's bad to constantly change like policies, right? Especially because it creates instability. So you don't exactly know what you're getting, right, from the United States government. And that's due to the nature of executive orders being issued at such fast rates because there isn't really this process you have to take to delicately like craft it, right? You just issue it, right? Your successor, if they disagree with you, remove it. They issue their own thing, and it just goes on and on like that. And I think the main part of this argument is with the impact, right? What exactly does instability cause, right? Because instability itself, like, yeah, right, it creates an unstable like policy making environment. But what exactly does that like lead to, right? It can translate to less effective policymaking if whatever benefits you have are like for 4 years maximum, right? It's instantly reversed, and then there's harms for 4 years, right? That means you can't definitively prove that there's a benefit from those executive orders. But more broadly, right, if there's an unstable environment, you can argue that it deters things like people like investors, right? Because they're like, okay, I might invest here, and then my policy like just flips instantly with a new president. What's going to happen then? I'm probably not going to go to the U.S. then, right? That like deters foreign investment into the U.S., for example, right? Um, there's lots of different things you can do there. I think you can probably find more generic but also tangible impact on this argument because it's like generic in the sense that it's not a specific executive order. It's more so from the idea of instability, but there's tangible impact you can have off of that. So yeah, um, that's this argument. Two more to go on the neg. Polarization. I think this is also a good one, right? If you're the president, you can just issue an executive order and like you don't have fellow members of Congress like voting or advising you on those orders, right? That's gonna like lead to you just doing whatever you want, essentially, right? And that often leads to more partisan policymaking, right? You don't really care about like moderates, you don't care about what the other side of the aisle believes. You just do your own thing, which creates more political polarization because policies like just executive orders are going to be more polarized. They're going to reflect more polarized views of different like issues within the country. And yeah, there's no incentive, unlike legislation, in which there's many Democrats and many Republicans, many like moderates as well, right, within Congress to kind of like set that balance and at least somewhat reduce this polarization compared to executive orders, right? Remember, it's all about the comparative. So yeah, and there's no incentive to kind of really care much about the public, right? You could argue, right, the president is held more accountable, but also insofar as you're appeasing your own supporter base, right? That's kind of what Trump's doing, right? You're getting away with it. Oh, that means that you're going to keep doing it, and that means executive orders are going to like keep getting more polarized, and it's not just going to be under this president; it's going to continue on under this trend, right? And the impact of polarization, I think this is relatively easier to find, right? It once again, it impacts policymaking as a whole. If you have a more polarized environment, it is very hard to actually get stuff passed because if you look to legislation, for example, right, nobody's going to do anything, and it's also going to like increase hostility within the country. You can say how that leads to like democracy crumbling. It leads to if you want to read like a civil war impact, that's up to you, right? I would recommend against it, but that's your choice. Yeah, just polarization bad. Those impacts are relatively easier to find online. And yeah, moving on to the final argument here, which is the concentration of power. Now, this is kind of this isn't really on like the discussion about whether or not like efficiency is good or bad. It's not about examples. It's about the idea of like the executive order itself, right? Having the president be able to like they are the sole person deciding what is exactly issued under their executive orders, right? That's probably a pretty bad thing for division of powers, right? Especially since um, the Constitution is supposed to was attempting to set a good balance of powers, right? Have checks and balances between the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches. But if you have the president doing whatever they want through executive orders, and the neg, when you're on the neg, you're going to argue that executive orders give so much power. As a result of that, right, it concentrates a lot of power into the hands of the president. And like, if you look to like Trump's executive orders, right, it's hard to overturn. This goes back to the checks and balances thing, right? It's like pretty hard for courts to keep up with the rapid rate of executive orders. So that means that when you have all this power in the hands of the executive, right? What does that mean for our democracy? What does that mean for the Constitution? Because it's kind of antithetical to the whole purpose initially of the Constitution, right? And remember that the executive order is a kind of like interpreted power. It's not an explicit power given by the Constitution. It was a kind of thing that was inferred to be given by nature of the enforcement of the law that the president needed to do. So that's why they started issuing it. So if you have power concentrated into the president, it's going to be kind of hard to find like a tangible impact, but it's more broadly just going to be bad for democracy because you have one branch which just controls the other two branches. That's the argument you're going to make here. So yeah, I believe that is all in terms of the arguments for today's topic lecture. That's all I have prepared here. To kind of summarize, right? Executive orders, it's directives issued by the president about the enforcement of an existing law. In recent times, presidents kind of like use it to kind of get what they want and specifically like leave out parts of legislation that they don't like and focus hard on parts that they actually do want to be enforced. And there's a list of arguments. I'll send the slides after this meeting. All right. What's an example that courts couldn't stop? I think. Let me think. I'm not the best with keeping up to date with the news, but I know for sure there's a lot of articles. I saw one the other day about how courts can't really stop Trump, not only because like of the fast rate that the executive orders are being issued, but also because like the Supreme Court specifically, right? It tends to be like leaning conservatively right now, which means that they're going to be less incentivized to stop Trump in the first place. So, in like if you look at more recent examples, right, you can argue probably that like the Supreme Court is going to be like less effective at checking against some stuff that Trump does, right? I think like um there, I can't. Apologies, I can't name one as of right now, but I think definitely if you like look just anything from January like 21st all the way until like now, this year, you can probably find something there. But yeah, I think the analysis part is a bit more important, right? Like just that the courts can't keep up with this rate that the executive orders are issued. Anything else? Feel free to unmute if you don't want to unmute. Feel free to leave something in chat. Yeah, of course, of course. Well, I'll give it maybe 3 more minutes till 55, and then I'll try to wrap it up. But yeah, do you think the neg should stick to specific orders or more general case? I think the like both the af and the neg are going to need examples, but I think like essentially don't let the examples debate take up everything, right? Don't let it be like like Emancipation Proclamation versus Japanese internment, right? I think that's going to be something where the judge is like, okay, well, here's an example of a good one, here's an example of a bad one, right? Um, I'd say like focus more on the general case, right? Especially on the neg, because I think the neg probably has a better time dealing with the like principle of executive orders as compared to the af, since you can talk about things like concentration of power, right? Constitutionality, instability, and polarization, right? So yeah, like try to make sure that you're kind of like focus, like the direction of your speech, each speech is focusing on the principle, but obviously you're going to need to support your speech with examples. Actually, for some arguments, maybe you don't actually need specific examples, right? But examples are always going to help you. Anything else? On balance, okay, yeah. So this is like um so yeah, in PF in general, whenever the topic is like something that looks like a policy making topic, right? For example, the nuclear energy topic, right? Like the U.S. government should substantially increase investment into that, right? That involves a uniqueness debate. I think in this topic, right, like you could argue technically that like the status quo should be defended by the AF because like the AF is a world with executive orders, right? But like fundamentally, the neg is technically going to be arguing for a world without executive orders, since if they prove that on balance executive orders are bad, that means that they're essentially arguing that like if we didn't have executive orders, we would live in a better world, right? So their world kind of translates to living like basically saying getting rid of executive orders, right? Um, but like I'd say don't really like do uniqueness stuff, especially since I mean I guess on the neg you should probably do uniqueness stuff, right? Just because you're saying like a lot of the stuff you're gonna bring up is about Trump. But in general, like if you're on the AF especially, right? And even if you're on the neg, bring up some uniqueness, but also like more so just it's kind of a debate about the principle itself, right? Because if you're talking about like, oh, look to right now, like we are in such a like bad living state, right? Like I guess it does kind of help you if you're on the neg, but also it doesn't really hit the mark of the topic, right? Which is like, okay, you still have to like explain specifically why executive orders themselves are the cause of all this, right? So yeah, I think like to summarize, fundamentally speaking, you are technically getting rid of executive orders in the neg world, but I'd say don't think of it as a traditional like the U.S. should do something, right? Don't think of it as like the U.S. should get rid of executive orders. Um, yeah. All right. I think that's 55. So I'll wait like maybe like 30 more seconds for any last minute questions. But um, if not, like feel free to always like just DM me on Discord or something. Um, and yeah, I'll send the link to the slides in the outreach debate server afterwards. So yeah, thank you everyone for showing up, and hopefully the topic lecture somewhat improved your research in preparation for the NATS topic.